The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished concrete as Margaret Chen pulled her old Honda Civic into the parking lot of Premier Luxury Motors. The car made a small grinding noise as she turned off the engine, a sound she had grown used to over the past 9 years. She sat for a moment looking through her windshield at the gleaming showroom ahead of her. The building was impressive, all glass and steel with modern lines that screamed expensive. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see rows of cars that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Mercedes, BMW, Audi, Lexus, all the brands that represented success and wealth in their city. Margaret stepped out of her car and immediately felt underdressed. She was wearing her usual weekend outfit, faded blue jeans with a small tear near the left knee, a gray sweater that had seen better days, and her comfortable white sneakers that were definitely showing their age. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a worn brown purse that had been her companion for at least 5 years. As she walked across the lot, she noticed how different she looked compared to the other customers she could see. There was a man in an expensive suit examining a silver Mercedes, talking on his phone about closing some big business deal. A woman in designer clothes was pointing at features on a red BMW, while a salesperson nodded eagerly beside her. Margaret moved slowly between the cars, taking her time to really look at them. She had never owned anything this fancy before, but that didn't mean she couldn't appreciate good engineering when she saw it. She stopped beside a deep blue sedan and peered through the window at the leather interior. The seats looked incredibly comfortable, and the dashboard had more buttons and screens than her entire living room. The lot was huge, with different sections for different brands. She walked past the Mercedes section, where the cars seemed to shine even brighter in the morning light. Their chrome bumpers and perfect paint jobs made her old Honda look like it belonged in a junkyard. But Margaret wasn't intimidated. She had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. As she continued her walk, she noticed the sales staff. They were all dressed professionally in dark suits and crisp white shirts. The men wore ties that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget, and the women wore jackets that fit perfectly and shoes that clicked confidently on the pavement. They moved with purpose, greeting customers with big smiles and firm handshakes. What struck Margaret most was how they seemed to size up customers in seconds. She watched as a young couple drove up in an older car similar to hers. The salespeople barely glanced in their direction. But when a man in a luxury SUV pulled up, 3 different staff members practically ran over to greet him. Margaret found herself in the BMW section, standing in front of a large white SUV that caught her eye. The X7, according to the small placard beside it. It was beautiful in a way that made her catch her breath. The lines were clean and powerful, and even sitting still it looked like it was ready to conquer any road. She walked around the vehicle slowly, admiring the design. The wheels were massive and looked like they could handle any terrain. The headlights had an almost angry look that somehow managed to be elegant at the same time. When she cupped her hands against the tinted windows and looked inside, she gasped softly. The interior was like nothing she had ever seen. The seats were covered in what looked like the softest leather, and everything had a rich, luxurious feel. There were screens everywhere, and the steering wheel looked like it belonged in a spaceship. She could almost imagine what it would feel like to sit behind the wheel, to feel that kind of power and comfort. A young salesman walked past her, talking animatedly on his phone about weekend plans. He glanced at her briefly, took in her appearance, and kept walking without breaking stride in his conversation. Margaret wasn't surprised. She had gotten used to being invisible in places like this. But she wasn't deterred. She continued examining the BMW, reading the information placard that listed features she had never heard of before. Adaptive cruise control, lane departure warning, massage seats. It was like reading about technology from the future. The price wasn't listed on the placard, but Margaret had done her research before coming here. She knew this particular model started at around $85,000. It was more money than many people saw in 2 years, but it wasn't an impossible dream for her, even if nobody looking at her would believe that. She moved to another car, a sleek sedan that was smaller but somehow looked even more expensive. The paint was so perfect it looked like liquid, and the chrome accents caught the sunlight and threw it back in brilliant flashes. Margaret found herself smiling as she imagined driving something like this to the grocery store or to visit her mother. The dealership was getting busier as the morning progressed. More customers were arriving, and Margaret could hear the sounds of negotiations and test drives happening around her. Engines revved, doors slammed, and the general buzz of commerce filled the air. She noticed how different customers were treated based on how they looked and what they drove to the lot. The well-dressed customers were immediately surrounded by helpful staff, offered coffee, and given detailed explanations of every feature. The customers who looked more ordinary like herself were largely ignored or given polite but distant treatment. Margaret didn't mind being left alone to browse. In fact, she preferred it. It gave her time to really look at the cars without feeling pressured. She could take her time, read the information, and think about what she really wanted. As she stood there in the morning sun, surrounded by more luxury than most people ever saw in one place, Margaret felt a quiet confidence. She knew something that none of these salespeople knew. She knew that she was exactly the kind of customer they should be eager to help. But she also knew that they would never see past her simple appearance to realize that truth. The irony wasn't lost on her. In a few minutes, she would walk into that gleaming showroom and ask about test driving one of these beautiful machines. And based on everything she had observed so far, she was pretty sure she knew exactly how that conversation was going to go. Margaret took one last look around the lot, adjusted her purse strap on her shoulder, and headed toward the showroom entrance. It was time to see just how wrong first impressions could be. The cool air conditioning hit Margaret's face as she stepped through the glass doors of Premier Luxury Motors. The showroom was even more impressive from the inside. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, and soft jazz music played from hidden speakers. The lighting was perfect, making every car look like a work of art. 3 beautiful cars sat in the center of the showroom, positioned like jewels in a display case. There was a red sports car that looked fast even while standing still, a black luxury sedan that screamed executive power, and in the back corner, another white BMW X7 just like the one she had been admiring outside. Margaret took a few steps inside and immediately felt all eyes on her. Not in a welcoming way, but in the way people look at someone who clearly doesn't belong. She could practically hear the thoughts running through their heads as they took in her worn clothes and modest appearance. Behind a large curved desk sat a man in his 40s wearing a perfectly pressed navy suit. His hair was slicked back with what looked like expensive gel, and his watch caught the light every time he moved his hand. He was typing something on his computer, occasionally glancing up at customers with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to judge wallets by appearances. 2 younger salespeople stood near the sports car, talking in low voices. One of them, a tall man with perfectly styled brown hair, gestured toward Margaret and said something that made his colleague smirk. They both looked like they had stepped out of a magazine ad for expensive cologne. Margaret walked slowly toward the BMW in the corner, her sneakers making soft, squeaking sounds on the polished floor. The car was even more beautiful under the showroom lights. Every curve seemed to flow perfectly into the next, and the white paint had a depth that made it look almost 3-dimensional. She stood there for several minutes, walking around the vehicle and admiring the craftsmanship. The attention to detail was incredible. Even the door handles seemed to be positioned at exactly the right angle. Margaret found herself wondering what it would feel like to sit inside, to turn the key and feel all that power respond to her touch. Finally, she decided it was time to take the next step. She walked over to the reception desk where the man in the navy suit was still typing. She waited patiently for him to acknowledge her, but he seemed determined to finish whatever he was working on. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up with the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, his tone suggesting that helping her was the last thing he wanted to do. "Yes, I'm interested in that BMW X7, Margaret said, pointing toward the white SUV in the corner. "I'd like to learn more about it and possibly take a test drive." The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He glanced at her outfit again, taking in every detail from her old sneakers to her simple purse. "The X7, he repeated slowly as if she had just asked about a spaceship. "That's a very expensive vehicle, ma'am." "I understand that," Margaret replying calmly. "Could you tell me about the features?" The man, whose name tag read Robert Wilson, sales manager, leaned back in his chair. "Well, that particular model starts at $85,000, he said. watching her face carefully for any sign of shock or backing down. That's before any of the premium packages or additional features. Margaret nodded. That's about what I expected. What can you tell me about the interior features? Robert's eyes narrowed slightly. He seemed surprised that she wasn't intimidated by the price. Listen, ma'am, I don't want to waste your time or mine. Maybe you'd be more interested in our pre-owned section? We have some very nice used vehicles that might be more suitable for your needs. The words hung in the air like a slap. Margaret felt her cheeks flush, but she kept her voice steady. I'm specifically interested in the new BMW. Could someone show me the interior? Robert sighed dramatically and called over one of the younger salesmen. Tony, this lady has some questions about the X7. Tony approached with the same false smile that seemed to be standard equipment at this dealership. He was probably in his late 20s with the kind of confident swagger that comes from making good money selling expensive toys to rich people. Hi there, Tony said, extending his hand for a quick handshake. So you're interested in the X7? It's a beautiful machine, no doubt about it. Have you driven anything like this before? The question was loaded with assumption. Margaret could hear the real question underneath. Do you have any idea what you're looking at? I've driven various vehicles over the years, Margaret answered diplomatically. Could you show me the interior features? Tony glanced back at Robert, who shrugged as if to say, Go ahead, but don't waste too much time. Tony walked over to the BMW and opened the driver's side door. Well, as you can see, it has leather seats, he said in the tone someone might use to explain something to a child. Margaret approached the car and looked inside. The interior was even more impressive up close. The seats looked incredibly comfortable, and the dashboard was like something from a science fiction movie. What about the technology features? She asked. Tony rattled off a few basic features without much enthusiasm. It was clear he was going through the motions, checking off boxes until he could politely get rid of her. The infotainment system is quite advanced, he said vaguely. There's GPS, Bluetooth, all the standard stuff. Could I sit inside and get a feel for it? Margaret asked. Tony hesitated. Well, I'd prefer if you didn't actually sit in it unless you're seriously considering a purchase. The leather can show marks, you know. Margaret felt another wave of humiliation. She had been in car dealerships before, and she had never been told she couldn't sit in a car she was supposedly considering buying. I am seriously considering it, she said firmly. That's why I'm here. Right, of course, Tony said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe her for a second. It's just that this particular model is very popular, and we like to keep the display vehicle in perfect condition. By now, other staff members were watching the interaction with barely concealed amusement. Margaret could see them whispering to each other behind car displays, occasionally glancing in her direction. She felt like an unwelcome guest at a party where everyone was too polite to ask her to leave directly. What I'd really like, Margaret said, deciding to push forward despite the hostility, is to take a test drive. I've read about the vehicle online, but I'd like to experience how it drives. The request seemed to catch Tony off guard. He looked back at Robert, who was now paying full attention to the conversation. Robert got up from his desk and walked over, his expression serious. A test drive, Robert said, as if she had just asked to borrow his personal car for a weekend trip. Well, that's a significant request. We have certain procedures we follow for test drives, especially on vehicles of this caliber. What kind of procedures? Margaret asked. Well, first we need to verify that you're a qualified buyer, Robert explained. We require proof of income, credit verification, that sort of thing. We can't just let anyone take an $85,000 vehicle off the lot. Margaret felt her patience beginning to wear thin. I understand the need for verification, but I'm simply asking for a test drive, not to take the car home. Company policy, Tony chimed in, looking relieved to have backup. We've had issues in the past with people who weren't serious buyers taking joyrides in expensive cars. I'm sure you understand. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. She was probably one of the most qualified buyers who had walked into this dealership in weeks, but because she didn't look the part, she was being treated like a potential car thief. Robert crossed his arms and looked at her with barely disguised impatience. Look, Mrs. Chen, Margaret supplied. Mrs. Chen, I'm trying to be helpful here, but I think you might want to consider starting with something a little more modest. We have some very nice certified pre-owned vehicles that might be more in your price range. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now. Margaret realized that no matter what she said, These people had already decided she didn't belong here. They had judged her based on her appearance and made up their minds that she was wasting their time. But Margaret wasn't ready to give up just yet. She had come here with a purpose, and she wasn't going to let their prejudice stop her from at least trying to be treated like a legitimate customer. "I appreciate your concern," she said quietly, "but I'm specifically interested in the X7, and I'm prepared to make a purchase decision today if the test drive goes well." The statement seemed to surprise both men. They exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this level of persistence from someone they had already written off. Robert and Tony exchanged another look, this one lasting longer than the previous ones. Margaret could practically see the wheels turning in their heads as they tried to figure out how to handle this unexpected persistence. Clearly, they had expected her to back down by now and quietly leave the showroom. "Mrs. Chen," Robert said, his voice taking on the patient tone people use when explaining something to someone they think is slow to understand. "I think there might be some confusion here about what exactly we're dealing with. This isn't just any SUV. This is a premium luxury vehicle with features that most people never experience in their lifetime." Margaret felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice calm. "Could you tell me more about those features? I'm particularly interested in the safety systems and the technology package." The question seemed to catch Tony off guard. He clearly hadn't expected her to know about specific packages. "Well, the technology package includes things like advanced navigation and premium sound system," he said vaguely, obviously not prepared to give a detailed explanation. "What about the driver assistance features?" Margaret pressed. "I've read about the adaptive cruise control and the lane-keeping assist. How do those work in real driving conditions?" Now both men looked genuinely surprised. Robert stepped closer, studying Margaret's face as if trying to figure out where she had gotten this information. "You've done some research," he said slowly. "Yes, I have," Margaret replied. "I don't make large purchases without understanding what I'm buying. That's why I'd like to experience the vehicle firsthand." By now, their conversation was drawing attention from other people in the showroom. A well-dressed couple who had been looking at the red sports car were glancing over with curious expressions. Two other salespeople had stopped what they were doing to watch the interaction unfold. Robert seemed to realize they were becoming a spectacle. He lowered his voice and moved closer to Margaret. "Look, Mrs. Chen, I'm going to be straight with you. This vehicle costs more than most people's houses. The monthly payments alone would be over $1,500, and that's with excellent credit and a substantial down payment." "I understand the financing options," Margaret said, "but I was actually planning to pay cash." The words dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. Both men stared at her for a moment, completely silent. Then Tony let out a small laugh that he quickly tried to cover with a cough. "Cash?" Robert repeated, his eyebrows raised. "You're talking about paying cash for an $85,000 vehicle?" "Yes," Margaret said simply. "Is that a problem?" Robert's expression shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like annoyance. "Mrs. Chen, with all due respect, that's a very significant claim. We've had people come in here before making grand statements about their purchasing power, and frankly, it wastes everyone's time." The accusation hung in the air like a bad smell. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, not because she was lying, but because she was being called a liar in front of a room full of strangers. "I'm not making grand statements," she said quietly. "I'm simply telling you how I intend to pay for the vehicle if I decide to purchase it." Tony jumped back into the conversation, apparently emboldened by his manager's skeptical attitude. "Okay, let's say you're serious about this cash payment. Do you have any documentation with you? Bank statements, proof of funds, anything like that?" Margaret looked at him incredulously. "Are you asking me to prove I have money before you'll let me test drive a car?" "It's not unreasonable," Robert said, crossing his arms defensively. "We're a business, not an entertainment venue for people's fantasy. So if you're serious about making a purchase of this magnitude, you should be prepared to demonstrate your financial capability." The conversation was getting louder, and Margaret noticed that the other customers in the showroom were now openly staring. She felt like she was in some kind of bizarre theater, where she was the unwilling star of a show about humiliation. "I've never been asked to prove my financial status before taking a test drive," Margaret said, her voice steady despite her growing anger. "In fact, I've never heard of such a requirement at any dealership." "Well, maybe you haven't been shopping for vehicles in this price range before. Tony said with a smirk that he didn't even try to hide. The comment was like a slap across the face. Margaret had been patient, polite, and persistent, but this level of disrespect was beyond anything she had expected. She looked around the showroom and noticed that other customers were being offered coffee, treated to detailed explanations of features, and generally welcomed with open arms. At that moment, a new couple walked into the showroom. The man was wearing an expensive-looking suit and designer shoes, while the woman carried a purse that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. Immediately, a salesperson rushed over to greet them with enthusiasm. "Good morning. Welcome to Premier Luxury Motors. Can I offer you some coffee while you browse? Is there any particular vehicle you're interested in seeing today?" The contrast was stark and unmistakable. Margaret watched as the couple was treated like royalty, while she stood there being questioned about her right to even be in the building. Robert noticed where her attention had gone and seemed to realize how obvious their discriminatory treatment had become. "Look, Mrs. Chen," he said, trying to regain some semblance of professionalism. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't you take some time to think about this purchase? It's a big decision and you shouldn't rush into anything." "I'm not rushing," Margaret replied. "I've been thinking about this for months. I know exactly what I want, and I'm prepared to make a decision today. All I need is a test drive to confirm that the vehicle meets my expectations." Tony let out an exasperated sigh. "Okay, fine. Let's say we arrange a test drive. What happens when you realize that this isn't the right vehicle for you? What happens when you see what the real monthly payments look like? Or when you understand the insurance costs? Then I'll look at other options," Margaret said. "But that's my decision to make, not yours." Robert was clearly losing patience with the entire situation. He glanced around the showroom, probably calculating how much time they were wasting on a customer he was convinced would never buy anything. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to be completely honest with you," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "This dealership caters to a very specific clientele. Our customers typically arrive in luxury vehicles. They have established relationships with high-end financial institutions, and they make purchases of this magnitude on a regular basis." The message was crystal clear. "You don't belong here." Margaret felt something inside her snap. Not into anger, but into a cold, determined resolve. "Are you telling me that I can't buy a car here because of how I look or what I drove here in?" "I'm not saying that at all," Robert backtracked quickly, realizing he had gone too far. "I'm simply suggesting that you might be more comfortable at a dealership that specializes in more affordable vehicles." "More comfortable for whom?" Margaret asked pointedly. "For me or for you?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Both men looked uncomfortable now, aware that their treatment of her had crossed lines that could potentially cause problems for the dealership. But instead of backing down or apologizing, Robert doubled down on his position. "Mrs. Chen, I think it would be best if you took some time to consider your options. Perhaps do some more research, talk to your financial advisor, that sort of thing." "My financial advisor already knows about this purchase," Margaret said calmly. "In fact, he suggested this particular dealership because of its reputation for customer service." The comment seemed to sting both men. Robert's face flushed slightly and Tony looked genuinely worried for the first time since the conversation began. "Well, I'm sorry you feel that way," Robert said stiffly, "but I have other customers to attend to, and I think we've covered everything we can cover today." It was a dismissal, pure and simple. Margaret looked around the showroom one more time, taking in the beautiful cars, the polished floors, and the obvious wealth on display everywhere. Then she looked at the faces of the staff members who were watching this interaction with varying degrees of interest and amusement. "I see," she said quietly. "So you're refusing to allow me to test drive a vehicle that I'm prepared to purchase with cash because you don't think I look like your typical customer." "That's not what I said," Robert protested, but his words lacked conviction. Margaret nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. "I think I understand the situation perfectly." She turned and began walking toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet showroom. Behind her, she could hear Robert and Tony already moving on, probably relieved to be done with what they considered a waste of time. But Margaret wasn't quite ready to leave yet. She stopped near the door and turned back to face the showroom, taking one last look at the BMW that had brought her here in the first place. What these people didn't know was that this story was far from over. Margaret reached the glass doors and placed her hand on the cool metal handle, For a moment she paused, looking back one last time at the showroom that had made her feel so unwelcome. The BMW X7 still sat in the corner, beautiful and untouchable, like everything else in this place that seemed designed to keep people like her out. She could hear Robert and Tony behind her, already moving on to other things. Their voices carried across the showroom as they discussed something about quarterly sales figures and upcoming inventory. It was as if the last 30 minutes had never happened, as if she had never existed at all. The well-dressed couple was now seated in the red sports car, with a salesperson explaining features with genuine enthusiasm. The woman was laughing at something the salesperson said, and Margaret could see coffee cups on a nearby table. This was how customers were supposed to be treated, she realized. This was what respect looked like. Margaret pulled the door handle and felt the cool morning air rush past her. She was about to step outside when she heard a car pulling up to the front of the building. The engine had a deep, powerful sound that made her look up. A sleek black Mercedes sedan was parking directly in front of the showroom entrance. Even from where she stood, Margaret could tell it was expensive. The kind of car that probably cost as much as the BMW she had been trying to test drive. The paint was perfect, the chrome gleamed, and everything about it screamed success and authority. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man in an immaculate charcoal gray suit. He was tall and confident with silver gray hair that was perfectly styled. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and his watch caught the sunlight as he moved. Everything about him said important person in a way that was impossible to ignore. Margaret stepped back inside the showroom, curious despite herself. She had learned to read people's reactions, and she could already see the change in the atmosphere. The salespeople had noticed the new arrival, and their body language shifted immediately. The man walked through the glass doors with the easy confidence of someone who owned the world. His presence seemed to fill the entire space, and conversations throughout the showroom became quieter as people turned to see who had arrived. Robert looked up from his desk, and his face immediately brightened. "Mr. Chen," he called out, practically jumping to his feet. "What a pleasant surprise. What brings you in today?" The man, Mr. Chen, smiled politely but didn't immediately respond. His eyes were scanning the showroom, taking everything in with the careful attention of someone who noticed details. Margaret realized she was staring and tried to blend into the background near the door. "Good morning, Robert," Mr. Chen said, his voice carrying easily across the space. "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by to see how things are going." Tony appeared as if by magic, suddenly abandoning whatever he had been doing to join the conversation. Other staff members were also gravitating toward the new arrival, all wearing the kind of eager expressions usually reserved for visiting celebrities. "Everything's going wonderfully, sir," Robert said, his voice taking on a tone Margaret had never heard from him before. It was respectful, almost reverential. "Sales are strong this quarter, and the team has been performing exceptionally well." Margaret watched this display with growing confusion. Who was this man that he could command such immediate attention and respect? The way the entire staff was acting, he must be someone very important indeed. Mr. Chen nodded thoughtfully, his eyes continuing to move around the showroom. "I'm glad to hear that. Customer satisfaction is still our top priority, I hope." "Absolutely, sir," Tony chimed in eagerly. "We've been providing outstanding service to every customer who walks through our doors." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Every customer? She thought about the last half hour, about being questioned, dismissed, and essentially escorted toward the exit. She thought about the casual disrespect, the assumption had she couldn't afford to be there, the suggestion that she would be more comfortable somewhere else. Mr. Chen's gaze swept across the showroom again, and this time it landed on Margaret. She saw his expression change slightly, a small frown creasing his forehead. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes suggested recognition. "I see," he said quietly, his attention still focused on Margaret. "And how has this morning been going specifically?" Robert followed Mr. Chen's gaze and noticed him looking at Margaret. A flash of something, panic maybe, crossed Robert's face. "Oh, this morning has been excellent, sir. Very productive." Mr. Chen took a step toward Margaret, his expression becoming more concerned. "Margaret?" he said, his voice carrying a note of surprise and confusion. "What are you doing here?" The question fell into the showroom like a bomb. Every conversation stopped. Every person turned to stare. The silence was so complete that Margaret could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. Robert and Tony looked between Mr. Chen and Margaret with growing alarm. The pieces of some puzzle were clearly falling into place in their minds, but they didn't like the picture that was forming. "Hello, David," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. "I was just looking at cars." David. The name hit Robert like a physical blow. Margaret watched as the color drained from his face and Tony took an actual step backward as if he'd been pushed. David Chen moved closer to his wife, his confusion deepening. "Looking at cars. But why didn't you tell me you were coming here?" "I could have arranged." He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes moving from Margaret's face to the expressions of his staff members. Margaret could see the exact moment when understanding dawned on her husband's face. His eyes hardened and his jaw tightened in a way she recognized. It was the expression he got when he was very, very angry but trying to control it. "What exactly has been happening here?" David asked, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made everyone in the showroom freeze. Robert stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly. "Mr. Chen, sir, I think there might be some misunderstanding." "I asked what has been happening here," David repeated, each word precise and clear. His eyes moved from Robert to Tony to Margaret. "And I want a complete answer." The showroom had become a stage and everyone was an unwilling actor in a drama that was unfolding in real time. The well-dressed couple had stopped their car shopping to stare. Other customers and staff members were watching with fascination and growing horror as they began to understand what was happening. Margaret looked at her husband and saw something she rarely saw in his eyes: cold fury. David Chen was known for his calm demeanor and professional composure, but right now he looked like a man who was holding back a storm. "Mrs. Chen was asking about the X7, Tony said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Chen?" David repeated, his eyebrows rising. "You mean my wife, Margaret?" The words hung in the air like an accusation. Robert's face had gone from pale to gray, and Margaret could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. Your wife?" Robert stammered. David turned to Margaret, his expression softening immediately. "Sweetheart, what did you want to know about the X7? "I wanted to test drive one," Margaret said simply. "I've been thinking about getting a new car and I thought I'd surprise you by handling it myself." David nodded, then turned back to his staff. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "And what did my employees tell you when you asked for a test drive?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, not wanting to get anyone in trouble but also not willing to lie. "They said I needed to prove I could afford it first." The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. David stared at Robert and Tony for a long moment, and Margaret could practically see him processing what his wife had just told him. "They asked you to prove you could afford it," he repeated slowly. "Yes," Margaret said. "They wanted to see bank statements and proof of income before they would let me test drive the car." David Chen stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear him. "I see." Those two words carried more weight than any shouting could have. Margaret watched as the full reality of the situation settled over everyone in the showroom. The owner of Premier Luxury Motors had just discovered that his own wife had been treated like an unwelcome intruder in his own business. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of consequences that everyone could feel approaching like a storm. The silence in the showroom stretched on until it became almost unbearable. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as she watched her husband process what he had just learned. David's face remained calm, but she knew him well enough to see the storm brewing behind his controlled exterior. Finally, David spoke, his voice still quiet but carrying absolute authority. "Robert, Tony, I'd like to speak with both of you in my office now." Robert's face had gone completely white. "Sir, I think there might be some misunderstanding about what happened." "Now," David repeated, and the single word cut through Robert's excuse like a knife. Both men started walking toward the back of the showroom where David's office was located. Their movements were stiff and awkward, like people walking to their own execution. Other staff members watched them go with expressions ranging from sympathy to relief that they weren't the ones being called into that office. David turned back to Margaret, and his expression immediately softened. "Sweetheart, I am so sorry about this. This is not how anyone should be treated here, least of all you." Margaret shook her head. You don't need to apologize, David. You weren't here. But this is my business, David said firmly. My name is on the building, and these are my employees. What happened to you reflects directly on me, and it's completely unacceptable. Around them, the showroom had resumed some semblance of normal activity, but Margaret could feel the curious glances and hear the whispered conversations. Word was spreading quickly among the staff about what had just happened. "Why don't you wait here for a few minutes?" David said gently. "I need to address this situation, and then we're going to make sure you get that test drive you wanted." Margaret nodded, and David walked toward his office with the measured stride of a man who had difficult decisions to make. She watched him go, feeling a mixture of embarrassment and vindication. Part of her wished this whole situation had never happened, but another part was glad that the truth had finally come to light. A few minutes later, she heard raised voices coming from the direction of David's office. Not shouting exactly, but the kind of intense conversation that comes when someone's job is on the line. Other customers in the showroom were starting to notice the commotion, and staff members were doing their best to look busy while obviously straining to hear what was happening. After about 10 minutes, David's office door opened. Robert emerged first, his face red and his tie slightly askew. He walked quickly through the showroom without making eye contact with anyone, heading straight for the exit. Tony followed a moment later, looking equally shaken. He paused near his desk to grab a few personal items, then headed for the door as well. David appeared in the doorway of his office and called out to the remaining staff. "Could I have everyone's attention for a moment, please?" The showroom quieted immediately. Even the customers stopped what they were doing to listen. David walked to the center of the space, his presence commanding attention from everyone present. "I want to make something very clear," he began, his voice carrying easily throughout the showroom. "At Premier Luxury Motors, we treat every customer with respect and professionalism, regardless of how they look, what they drive here in, or how much money we think they have." His eyes moved around the room, making contact with each staff member. "What happened here this morning was completely unacceptable and goes against everything this business stands for. I want everyone to understand that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated under any circumstances." Margaret felt a flush of pride as she listened to her husband address the situation head-on. This was one of the things she loved about David. When something was wrong, he fixed it, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might be. Going forward, David continued, "Every customer who walks through our doors will be treated as a valued potential buyer, until they prove otherwise through their actions, not through our assumptions about their appearance or financial status." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "Are there any questions about this policy?" The room remained silent. Everyone understood the message perfectly. David nodded and walked back to where Margaret was standing. "Now," he said with a smile that reached his eyes for the first time since he'd arrived, "I believe my wife was interested in test driving a BMW X7. A young salesman named Peter, who had been watching the entire drama unfold from a respectful distance, immediately stepped forward. "Absolutely, sir. I'll get the keys right away." "Thank you, Peter," David said. "And please make sure Mrs. Chen gets the full demonstration of all the features she's interested in." Peter nodded eagerly and hurried off to retrieve the keys. Margaret watched him go with amusement. The difference in attitude was like night and day compared to how Robert and Tony had treated her just an hour earlier. "You don't have to do this," Margaret said quietly to David. "I know you're busy and this whole situation has been—" "Absolutely not," David interrupted gently. "You came here to look at a car and you're going to get the full experience. Besides, I want to see what you think of the X7. If you like it, we should talk about adding it to our family fleet." Peter returned with the keys and a tablet computer loaded with information about the vehicle. His enthusiasm was genuine and infectious as he began explaining the features Margaret had asked about earlier. "The X7 comes with our most advanced driver assistance package," he said, his voice filled with the kind of excitement that comes from talking about something you genuinely love. "The adaptive cruise control is incredible. It can actually handle stop-and-go traffic by itself." For the next 20 minutes, Peter walked Margaret through every feature of the BMW. He answered all her questions thoroughly and honestly, never once suggesting that she might not understand something, or that the vehicle might be beyond her means. When they finally went outside for the test drive, Margaret slid behind the wheel of the X7 and immediately understood what all the fuss was about. The seat adjusted perfectly to her body. The controls fell naturally under her hands, and when she started the engine, it responded with a quiet purr that promised incredible power. David rode in the passenger seat while Peter sat in the back, continuing to explain features as they drove through the city. The X7 handled like a dream, smooth and responsive and incredibly comfortable. Margaret found herself smiling as she navigated through traffic, enjoying the way other drivers seemed to give the BMW extra respect. "What do you think?" David asked as they returned to the dealership. "I think," Margaret said with a grin, "that our Honda Civic is about to get a very impressive garage mate." Back at the dealership, the paperwork process was smooth and professional. Peter handled everything with efficiency and courtesy, making sure Margaret understood every aspect of the purchase agreement. When she mentioned paying cash, his only response was to smile and begin preparing the appropriate documentation. As they were finishing up the paperwork, David pulled Margaret aside. "I want you to know that what happened here today is going to lead to some changes," he said seriously. "We're going to implement new training programs to make sure this never happens again." Margaret nodded. "I think that's a good idea. Nobody should have to go through what I went through today. I'm also going to make sure that every staff member understands that customer service isn't just about making sales," David continued. "It's about treating people with dignity and respect. Period." 3 hours after Margaret had first walked into Premier Luxury Motors feeling unwelcome and dismissed, she was driving off the lot in her new BMW X7. But more importantly, she was leaving behind a dealership that had learned an important lesson about judging people by their appearance. As she pulled into traffic, Margaret caught a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror. She was still wearing the same worn jeans and simple sweater, still had her graying hair in a practical ponytail, but now she was driving a vehicle that represented not just luxury and comfort, but something more important, the principle that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of how they look. The story would become legendary among the staff at Premier Luxury Motors, a reminder that you never know who might walk through your doors. And thanks to the changes David implemented, it would be the last time anyone at his dealerships would make the mistake of judging a customer by their appearance. Margaret smiled as she drove home, already planning the surprised look on her daughter's face when she saw the new car. Sometimes, she reflected, the best lessons come from the most unexpected places.